Welcome to The Velocity Trap. Today we're going to talk about a pitfall I see many organizations struggling with. But before we get started, let me introduce myself. My name is Brad Nelson, and this is the typical slide at the beginning of a presentation where I'm supposed to convince you of how important I am so that you'll listen to me. I assure you I have worked for some big names, including one that I'll reference in this presentation, and I have the certifications. But what I'd rather tell you about is the range of experience I have acquired to get to where I am today. Currently, I am a software development coach and team lead for Insight Digital Innovation with specialized training in Agile and organizational change management. However, I started my journey in manufacturing. I was a line lead of over 60 people, and I was a trainer that focused on standardized work and increasing throughput with efficiencies. After several years in assembly and steel stamping, I entered IT software development. In IT, I've been a tech support, QA, BA, developer, designer, and Scrum Master. This broad spectrum of experience has enabled me to coach enterprises at both a strategic and tactical level. I pulled from these experiences when creating this presentation, and I leaned on some of my passion areas in UX and product management. And on that note, let's get started. To measure is to know. If you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. This quote actually is not true. As Dr. Deming has demonstrated, you can improve without measurement. However, if you're not measuring, how do you know that you're actually improving? So I want us to get into the mindset of, if we're not measuring, we don't know. I like to think of metrics as my flashlight, or in the case of this presentation, a lantern, because I thought it looked more artistic. Anyway, metrics and lanterns won't illuminate the world, and they'll only show us where we point them. But without them, we are completely in the dark. In the professional world, we should be asking constantly, where are we going, or what are we trying to accomplish? And how will we illuminate that path to know if we're in the right direction, or if we've made it at all? As far as I'm concerned, this is a non-negotiable. We can no longer live in a world solely on gut feelings. Not that gut feelings don't have a time and a place. The two categories of metrics we're going to talk about in this presentation are outputs and outcomes. An output is a measurement of production. An outcome is the result of outputs. In traditional business, measuring outputs is a common practice. In order to sell more products, I need to produce more, and it has to be of a certain quality. This is easier to get away with for physical products and when there was less competition. Now we live in a very competitive world, and in software development, our end goal isn't necessarily to produce more of something. For the most part, if your app is available for one person, it's available for anyone. Keep these two in mind, we'll come back to these. The first rule of business: why are businesses in business? To make money. Well, at least that might be your first thought. Although companies often think of their desired outcome as making more money, that's actually not the case. It's a perversion of the truth. Companies oftentimes devolve into an obsession over money, not helped by the stock market, but that's not how they started. People don't buy things from a company because they want that company to have more money, just like employees aren't motivated to make things so that a company can make more money. The company provides something that people want. If what you're building doesn't increase the desire for a customer to use your service or buy your product, then it's not beneficial for your company. Because if people stop buying from you, then you will have no company. We need to rewrite the way we think from how can I make more money off people to how can I fulfill more wants and needs. Of course, at a profit, because it's necessary for us to be able to continue to provide our products and services. You'll know when you got it right, because customers vote with their wallets. I may not like all of Amazon's business practices, I may not like the idea of a monopoly, but I still buy from Amazon because they get me what I want at a reasonable rate, within a reasonable time period, with very little effort on my part. So I want you to think value equals demand. To further emphasize my point, here's a quote, because everything seems more true when it's a quote. Consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production, and the interest of the producer ought to be attained to only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer. This sounds like some old-timey hippie stuff, right? Well, It's actually a quote from the father of capitalism. Alright, back to Amazon. You all have heard of this company before, right? Yeah, I just mentioned them 2 slides ago. Now, a lot of things can be said about this company, good and bad. But the one thing I want to point out for the sake of this presentation is that Amazon has never lost sight of its customer. Not only does Amazon offer free shipping to its Prime members, but 1 to 2 days shipping on top of that. Okay, so it's not free. You pay for it every year, but they'd like you to think it's free. Anyway, Amazon spends a lot of money on shipping. What's a lot look like? Well, here's some numbers from their annual report. To give you some context, in 2018, Amazon made $5 billion in operating income, $7.2 billion in operating income in North America, and actually lost $2.1 billion internationally. They spent over 5 times what they made on shipping. And yet, Amazon made up for nearly 50% of all online sales in the US in 2018. That is a dominant footprint. I had a similar experience when I was at Meijer. There was a little company called Shipt that created their own website, and what they allowed people to do is to shop on their website at local stores, and then they would deliver those things to your house. Now, Meijer caught wind of this, and they realized that there was demand for grocery deliveries to your home, and so instead of trying to create their own service and figuring it out, what they did is they actually partnered with Shipt. They made a deal where if Shipt was shopping for customers in Meijer's area, they would default to Meijer. And to enable Shipt to be even more successful, they actually developed an app and an API, and they did a whole bunch of stuff to make it easier for Shipt shoppers to get in and out of the store, which also impacts Meijer's regular shoppers less as well. Now, Meijer didn't make any extra money off of Shipt. However, they made sure that they kept the customers that they had by staying competitive in their field, and they acquired new customers that might not have shopped at their store because of this service. The big 3 are the major automotive companies in the US, and they were dominant for many years. GM went from its peak of 50% of the car market in the 60s to the 17% that it owns today. Sure, it's still the #1 car manufacturing company in the US, but it went from nearly doubling Ford to having only a couple percent lead. And all 3 have really suffered from the invasion of international automakers. The reason is because they lost sight of their customers. At one point, they actually knew them quite well. You see, cars were considered a luxury item, and therefore, what people really cared about was style. These 3 automakers were glad to oblige their customers by dedicating most of their efforts to design. It wasn't until other automakers from Germany and Japan entered the market that people realized they could both have that elegant design along with higher quality standards. Add on the introduction of safety regulations, and the big 3 floundered. It shows us that it's not just important to know your customer at one time, but to continue to know your customer. What about Kodak? Yeah, everyone is probably sick of hearing about Kodak and Blockbuster, but bear with me. So most people know that Kodak used to be the dominant camera company, and they went out of business due to the invention of the digital camera. However, did you know that Kodak actually invented the first digital camera? They did. However, they thought it went against their core business model of film, and therefore refused to release it to the public. They lost sight of why they were in business and settled for a short-term win. In fact, the first digital camera was released to the public by Nikon using Kodak's patent. So now that we've talked about a couple examples of companies that either did or didn't know their customers, how do we know when we should or shouldn't do something? And for that, I would like to use the innovation sweet spot. First, you need to start with desirability. Do your customers actually want this? Then, we need to actually be able to make it a reality, aka it has to be feasible. And last, but not least important, it has to be viable, meaning it has to actually make us money or be a part of some strategic move to make us money, similar to Amazon's investment in shipping. Viability is important. If we never make money, we're not going to be in business for very long. The point, though, is that we need all three. If your idea isn't desirable, it doesn't matter how much money it could make your company. Likewise, it might be great for an end customer. I would love it if you just gave me $1 million. And of course, we have to actually be able to accomplish it in a timely manner. All three things are necessary, but desirability comes first. That's why it's at the top. Now, when looking at what is desirable, we have to remember the false consensus effect. You are not the user. No matter how much we think we might be, no matter how much you use your own product or services, at the end of the day, you're biased. When I was at Meijer, I would frequently get requests from senior leadership, all the way up to the C-suite, and there was this impression that they all shopped at Meijer, so they were all customers. However, how many Meijer shoppers do you think make C-suite money? How many customers do you think worry about the viability of the products they're buying? So how do we know what customers want? Well, we observe them. Super creepy like with binoculars. Okay, maybe we try not to creep our customers out, but we do observe them. The first rule of usability is that users don't know what they want, so you can't just ask them, you have to observe them. If 50% of users said that they'd be more likely to buy something from your store if you used augmented reality because it sounds cool, it doesn't necessarily mean that they would, or that you should rush to implement that. The caveat is you can ask users defining factors about themselves. For example, what is their occupation, salary, their intent, etc. From there, what we want to do is group people by similar problems. Unless you're in the fashion industry, they're probably not going to be wearing the same clothes. Then we document our findings, maybe in the form of a persona, so that we can refer back to them frequently while discovering and developing our product. This here is a super basic persona, which is a tool designers use to capture the end user. You create a lifelike profile of an individual that would use your service or buy your product based on actual research of your customers. And there are three main ways to use a persona: end goals, journey maps, and scenarios. An end goal is, what is this persona trying to accomplish? Or a journey, what is the process the persona will go through in order to accomplish that goal? Or you can put them in varying scenarios. How would the persona interact with your software in this particular instance? Once you have an understanding of how your customers think and interact and the problems that they're trying to solve, you can then map them out in something like an impact map. An impact map allows you to identify your users or your actor, their goal and pain, and then map that to an impact, which is the viability for your organization. How will we know that solving this pain will actually be impactful to our organization or make us money? And from there, then you can go into the feasibility. How are we going to deliver it? These are your solutions, and they should really map down to your teams at a story level. To truly know your customers and map their wants, needs, and friction points to organizational initiatives is a lot more involved. And honestly, there's enough work that pretty much everything we do should be able to be valuable for both parties, your organization and the customer. You need to fall in love with the user problem first, the end goal or pain point, before deciding if it has a benefit for your business. One of the more common mistakes I see companies make is they try to solve a problem that isn't really a problem. They fall in love with a solution. It's also important that your metric for success is actually beneficial. For example, it's easy to make the conclusion that if someone is spending more time on my site, they're going to spend more money. However, that is an assumption. Just the act of spending time on your site doesn't necessarily mean they're spending money or that they're enjoying their experience. Maybe they're having a hard time finding what they're looking for, or maybe they left the page open to save their place. The real metrics you might be interested in are overall purchases, purchase frequency, cart size, returning customers, and so on. And just like my persona was made up for this presentation, so is this impact map. However, the things on this impact map are things that I actually did during my time at Meijer. When I was at Meyer, I worked in their loyalty department, which was closely connected to their e-com site as well. And so some of these things that you'll see were really things that we did. Shipped is an example of the pickup and delivery solutions that we looked into. And we knew that people enrolled in their loyalty program tend to spend more money. Well, we sort of knew. I'm pretty sure there was some funny math going on there, but for the sake of this story, we'll say that we knew. Therefore, our goal was to get more people enrolled in the loyalty program. But it wasn't enough that we wanted them to spend more money. We had to make the program desirable for the user. So we worked hard to create transparency into the program. Here's what it has to offer you. Here's where you're at with your rewards progress. Here's a cool feature only accessible to loyalty members. For example, there was a time when you had to actually create an account before you could even access the app. It was a huge barrier of entry. And we did our due diligence, we did our research, and we found that a lot of people fell off throughout the enrollment process. So we actually did two things. The first thing we did is we made it a lot easier to enroll. We simplified that process. We looked at what were the trouble areas and what were the things that were scaring users away. And we got rid of them. And we asked ourselves some pretty hard questions. What do we really need in order for a person to be enrolled? The second thing we did is we moved all of the features of the app that didn't require us to know who you were out from behind that wall. Therefore, a user could install the app, they wouldn't have to authenticate, and they could get benefit from it. And once they were able to get benefit from it, they were able to see these other features that were hidden behind this wall, and they were able to see what value it offered them before going through the work of signing up. And therefore, when they did decide to sign up, they were willing to go through the effort because they already knew the value they were going to get. Another tool you can use is a lean UX canvas. It helps us map out our problems, the affected people, our proposed solution, why it's beneficial, and most importantly, how we will know if we're right. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but I just wanted to share that this is just a simple writing map that you can use that covers everything that we've discussed so far. The second inconvenient truth is that even with the ideas that we do prove to be valuable, usable, and feasible, it typically takes several iterations to get the implementation of this idea to the point where it actually delivers the expected business value. This is a quote by Marty Kagan, author of Inspired, in The Inconvenient Truth About Products. What this says is, we need to iterate. And that brings us to our agile practices and techniques. According to the scientific method, we need to create a plan for the value we're trying to realize. Then we need to take a baseline of where we're currently at. After that, we move into the do phase, where we create the smallest possible functionality to see if our hypothesis is correct. This prevents us from investing too much time or money into something that is not correct, or over-engineering the right solution. From there, we need to release it into the wild to see if our predictions were correct. Then we act on those findings. That's another area where I see a lot of companies missing the mark. They do great work. They come up with an idea, they plan it out, they do it, they deliver it, they even measure it, but they never act on those findings. Here's what this might look like as a decision tree. First and foremost, we're going to develop and release our feature, and then we need to ask ourselves, was the value we were trying to achieve realized? If the answer is yes, we're done. Pop the champagne, throw a party, move on to the next thing. If the answer is no, then we need to ask ourselves, is there more worth trying? It's okay if the answer is no again, then we'll fail fast. We've learned, and we haven't invested a bunch of money. But if it's yes, then we iterate. We go back into the development and release the feature, and then we ask ourselves the question again, was the value realized? And we do it over and over and over again until we are successful or there's nothing else worth trying. Back to Lord Kelvin's quote, life is a maze. There's no book on success, although many have tried. There's no one set formula you can use every time. The trick is to spend as little amount of time in innovation before you have an opportunity to test whether or not the value was realized. And the only way to do that is to measure where we're at, take a baseline of what we're trying to change, then measure again after we've developed the new feature. And always remember why you are in business in the first place, to fulfill wants and needs of your customers. All right, I know we talked a lot about what value is, but now we need to talk about the second rule. Where is value realized? And the answer is value is realized in production, or the hands of your users. Have you heard the saying, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush? I see a lot of teams that consider themselves agile or very progressive, and they have a very mature definition of done, and they move all of their work through their workflow, and they check a box, and they're done. However, there's this whole area that some people call undone work, where the work has to go through the process before it's actually released to users. And so what you actually have is an invisible queue where work is building up and where value is not being realized. It does you no good on the shelf. In fact, you're losing money because you've already invested money in it without realizing a return. So we need to make sure that we get things in the hands of our users, and we need to make sure that we're testing in the hands of our users, no matter how similar our environments might seem. Goldratt tells us a story in The Goal, where the main protagonist meets up with his mentor to gloat about increasing efficiency of production. I don't remember the exact amount, we'll say 15%. The mentor, Jonah, asks Alex if they are selling more cars. Alex doesn't know, he's not in sales. So Jonah pushes further to ask Alex if they laid off 15% of their workforce, to which Alex responds, of course not. Jonah surmises then if they have not increased sales or decreased costs, then there really was no value gained by increasing the efficiency. Let's think of that from an IT standpoint. If you increase the amount of work you get done, but you aren't releasing more often, then have you really added any value? Items waiting to be released in that undone state I just mentioned are a huge form of waste. And once again, it's not enough just to release it to production. We need to validate it in production. There's a rule that comedians like Seinfeld live by. Laughter is the only measure for funny. If it's not funny, the crowd won't laugh. Similarly, if your product, feature, insert solution is not used, it's not useful, it's not valuable. And we're not talking about canned value. Remember our decision tree? This is done in production with real users. When we release a feature, we're releasing to production. Okay, so we're learning what value is, we're releasing it to production. How do we decide what to measure? Well, you get what you measure. So we want to be conscious of our ultimate goal, that is, adding value. Therefore, we want to measure things that directly correlate with our value. After measuring our desired outcome, we can start to look at software development metrics or outputs. Outputs contribute to outcomes. Therefore, your outputs should measure your ability to produce outcomes. Outputs aren't inherently bad, and they do have their uses, but they can also be misleading. I had a boss who was a bodybuilder. The guy probably had 6% body fat, but the insurance company used BMI for rates, and he was rated too heavy for his weight, and had to lose weight or pay a higher premium. Likewise, not all outputs are made equal. Some outputs serve a particular purpose, and some outputs are known to drive poor behaviors. In the end, you should only measure what is necessary. If we look back at our impact map, you'll notice that my impact is actually an outcome. The Caseys of the world bought more discounted items than previously. They voted with their wallets. My metric for success is not how many push notifications I sent. If I get what I measure, then what am I trying to achieve? After I understand what my value is, there might be some outputs that I'll measure for my development team as they're working towards achieving this value to understand if we're on the right track or to help me with predictability and those sort of things. But what we have to remember is that there's a right tool for the job. Not all tools are right for the job, and a metric is a tool. So not all metrics are right for the job. So if value is realized in production, some of the most important metrics to track are around getting value to production. And so the first metric I want to talk about is lead time or throughput. And it's really the time it takes something to go from aha to ka-ching. Second valuable metric is release frequency. How often do we release into production to actual end users? And a third metric that you would probably want to look at is time to restore. It's how long does it take to fix a bug, system failure, and so on in production. If your goal is predictability, when am I going to get the thing that I want? A metric that you could use, again, is lead time and throughput. And how this works is you tend to get X amount of items done to production in a certain amount of time, then that is when you get X number of things. So it's actually a very valuable metric to use. Then there's cycle time, which is basically throughput for one individual item. And lastly, how much time is spent on rework, things not on the roadmap, and defects identified by end users, or better known as unplanned work. Unplanned work is the silent killer of IT. It's the CO2. Companies and teams fall apart so many times because they don't manage their unplanned work. And lastly, what is the quality of my product? There are a lot of various ways people can track these, some with various levels of effectiveness, but these three are things that you should be familiar with. And the first is a Net Promoter Score. Now, it can be any form or version of interviewing your users. It doesn't have to be an NPS. For the sake of this presentation, I chose this one. But the real question is, what do your users think of your product? Do they think it's easy to use? Do they view it as having high quality? Because it doesn't matter if it doesn't have high quality if your users think it does. And usually it's the other way around. You think it has higher quality than your customers do. Another metric you could look at is change failure rates. How often do we fail to successfully deploy a release? And another item is your uptime or error budget. What sort of tolerance do we have for downtime with our product? If your uptime is something like Google's, which is 99.99%, then your error budget is 0.01%. And that means that if your system, your services, your product, whatever you offer, ends up going down more than 0.01% of the time, you have to stop all new development and fix the stability of your system first. All right, so we talked about some metrics that I would encourage you to use. Now, these are some metrics that tend to be more focused on the performance of IT things, and they're not focused on value. So though they may serve a purpose depending on your situation, they should not be your go-to metrics for every situation because they don't directly have an impact on value. And the first one is effort, which is hours or story points, and it goes back to the title of this presentation, the velocity trap. Velocity is a common word for effort, and it's probably the metric that I see abused the most in organizations. They actually grade their teams based on their velocity. Well, the numbers are made up, so they don't really matter if you're using story points. And yeah, you can look at hours, but just because somebody is utilized doesn't mean that they're using their time effectively. And just because the team is busy doesn't mean that they're actually adding value. In fact, what you end up having is you end up having teams that are pumping out a bunch of stuff, a lot of features, a lot of development, a lot of code, and you're paying for it, and it's costing you a lot of money, and you're not getting any return on those investments. Although you might find value in velocity, you can actually get the same thing that you would get from velocity by tracking throughput instead. You need to make sure that you don't treat throughput the same way though, because throughput also isn't adding value. You need to make sure you're measuring your value. Now remember, your value is unique to the thing that you're trying to solve. And on the similar to the hours discussion is developer utilization. As I mentioned, just because your developer is busy doesn't necessarily mean they're busy doing the right things. Now I hope this one is becoming less common, but it's still been a pretty popular one throughout the years, and it's lines of code committed. Some people measure whether or not they're getting what they want out of their developers by how many lines of code they committed. And this is a huge fallacy. Not only does it go against some of the best practices of trying to write simple, elegant code that's very readable, I could write lines and lines of code and abstract things all day and accomplish nothing. In fact, if you're worried about if you're fully utilizing your employees, you're probably actually hurting their performance. Research has proven that focus is the key to getting things done, and like a computer, If a person is fully utilized, they're going to slow down and likely make mistakes. And last but certainly not least, on time and on budget. This is another really common measure of success in IT, especially in project management. If the project is on time and on budget, then it's valuable. However, we don't really know it's valuable just because it's on time and on budget. If you've invested $1 million into something, did you get $1 million back? Did you get 2 million? Or did you lose all that money? We don't know just because it's on time and on budget. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't track your budget, because we need to know what money we're investing in order to know what we're getting back, but it's not a measurement of value in of itself. Another area that I see companies slip into is, oh, I've already invested this much money into this. What you've spent in the past is gone. It should not be considered in decisions going forward. Instead, the question should be, will the remaining cost to implement this yield a return greater than that cost? We didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we lost. This is a famous quote from Stephen Elop when Microsoft purchased Nokia for a fraction of the price. Nokia was a powerhouse in the mobile market. Early in the century, they had 50% of the market, and we all know how that ended. I've heard multiple reasons why this happened. Technical debt was a big one, but I can't help but think they also lost sight of what really mattered. And I relate this back to our on time and on budget. My suspicion from being in the field and in the industry is that a lot of these major companies that we're seeing going under are because they're measuring the wrong things. They're measuring their projects on time and on budget. However, they're not measuring the value. Okay, so let's review the 3 business rules we went over today. Number 1, value equals demand. Number 2, value is realized in production. And 3, you get what you measure. Yes, it's easy to measure outputs because it's the same measurement every single time. However, the problems that we're trying to solve aren't the same every single time. So we need to make sure we're measuring the outcomes of the problems we're trying to solve. The Professional Product Owner is a book that pretty much covers everything in this presentation, and I found it after I'd completed the presentation, so I was pretty shocked. I would say that I would highly recommend this book if you're interested in what we went over today. Inspired by Marty Kagan is probably the best book I've read on product management. It covers a lot of user experience stuff as well and how you can map it into product management, and I can't recommend it enough. And last but not least, Accelerate is one of my favorite books of all time. It has done some great research on what outputs actually affect the bottom line, and most of the metrics that I covered today, the outputs, are from this book, Accelerate. Likewise, the first chapter of the Agile Leadership Toolkit teaches KVIs, key value indicators. The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek talks about the importance of knowing your customers and doing what's right in the long run. There's the Goal, the Phoenix Project. If you're looking for a free resource, Scrum.org has evidence-based management, and it's a relatively short read and a quick resource if you just want to dig in a little. And last, if you're looking to pay for some training, the Professional Scrum User Experience course covers a lot of this stuff and then some. All right, we've made it to the end. This is normally where I'd ask questions. For today, it's just my dog tax slide. And so I want to thank you for sticking with me. Please add me on LinkedIn. If you have questions, you can reach out to me on my email. It's there as well. So I hope this presentation was insightful, and thank you for your time.